We as ADB need to incorporate digital into our DNA. We also need to do more to help the region accelerate its digital transformation. Together, we can emerge from the pandemic stronger, more inclusive, and sustainable.
Hello and welcome to DigitalxADB and today's session on building national ID, principles on identification for development. I'm Yuni Zhang with Digital Technology for Development Unit at ADB and your host for today's session. Before we launch into the session, we'd like to ask everybody to take a quick poll to tell us a little bit about yourself, which stakeholder you represent, and the relevance of today's topic to your work. And as you're filling this poll, I just wanted to remind everyone to use the Q&A function on the virtual event platform to pose questions to the speakers, and they'll try to address them during this session. Okay, Impact Up, if you could post the results. So with this housekeeping out of the way, now it is my pleasure to invite the moderator of today's session, Ms. Xiaohong Yang, Chief Thematic Officer of Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of ADB. Ms. Xiaohong, over to you.
Thank you so much, our digital colleagues. And it's a small unit, but it has done great. You can see how high-tech you are in opening today's event. So I want to start beginning to talk about the future is digital. So today's theme is about building national ID. We talk about ADB has been supporting many our DMCs. We call it developing member countries in building their national ID systems. So this has been very great success. We have been receiving a lot of demand from the countries, for example, the Cambodia, the Philippines, and we work very closely with World Bank and countries like India, Thailand, Philippines, Pakistan, so on and so forth, to build up their national ID system in many DMCs. So before this job, I have been working for Pakistan as a country director for the past 4 to 5 years. Actually, I can see the national ID system how much changes it can bring to the tribal area. Just before this, I come back to Manila. I visited a tribe area. I can see the huge differences the SRS program has brought to these people, especially the female-headed households, huge differences. So in 2016, ADB has joined the Global Initiative on ID, which is actually led by the World Bank in early 2017. So ADB also endorsed the Principles Identification for Sustainable Development Principle, together with many other development partners. So this is a huge area. We like to collaborate with everyone on the call. I'm glad to see there's a lot of private sector joining today's call. That is very interesting. So let me begin by quickly introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Gard. Are you there? Yeah, very good.
Yes, thank you.
And our CEO of Unidai. And you know, he's now in charge of CEO of this world's largest biometric ID system. It was established in 2009, and then it has now covered 90% of UID has been already issued. I asked many of my Indian colleagues, they're all very proud to show me what it is. So it is really, really wonderful. And then how that has evolved, and then what kind of good practices and lessons the Indian experience can be really very useful for the other countries to develop in this area. And also Dr. Guy has been working as both government and private sector, and you work very interesting. You have very interesting background. I respect you a lot. Look at you. You are working at different levels of government, district, state, and central government. This is a lot, and also private sector and World Bank. I work in various sectors, agriculture and farmers, also the FDI policies, all the way to also the bilateral investment treaties and negotiation. That's very rich background. Over to you, Dr. Gar.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I will just talk a bit on the unique identity system, which is called Aadhaar. Aadhaar in Hindi means foundation. We started in 2009, as you mentioned, and by now we have issued this ID for 1.3 billion people. If you can go to the next slide. Out of the total, just to give you an overview of where we are in the digital space, we have nearly 1.2 billion mobile subscribers, and the internet usage is increasing on a day-to-day basis, and partly fueled and supported by the Aadhaar ID system. We have more than 1.4 billion accounts, which is more than our population. Though obviously there will still be some people who may not be having bank accounts, but it's a much smaller number now. Next. One of the reasons why we needed the ID, and you mentioned it in your presentation also, that it helps to target subsidies much more easily and clearly, and nearly over 2.5% of our GDP is sent in different kind of welfare measures across the country, and that's where a very important need for the ID. Next. The challenge was that prior to a decade back, about 10 years back, we didn't have any nationally accepted ID. And what is even more important, there was nothing which was universally where you could authenticate it. And the Aadhaar system ensured that there is a robust lifetime reusable ID, which is verifiable anytime, anywhere. And I think that's been the real benefit of this. It has reduced the cost of delivery of services. It has transformed the way we can think of services which government services couldn't even think of prior to this. And I think it helps empower a lot of people, because a lot of people who are vulnerable, once they have an ID, they feel so much more empowered in their day-to-day activities also. Next. So as I mentioned, we look at the digital infra as a public good on which we would want the private sector and other government agencies to be able to build up innovative solutions. I'll be talking a few of them as in my presentation. Next. This is just a historical background that we started way back in 2005, and a formal statutory authority it became in 2016, and where we now have more than 300 different programs which use the Aadhaar backbone to be able to deliver services. Next. Some of the key features, we are maintaining primacy of user content. We can't allow Aadhaar for any kind of profiling. It's truly portable because of being it's biometric, you can't even lose it. No one can duplicate it. And it remains with you for the lifetime because of the nature of the biometrics that we collect. Next. Next. Just to give an idea of what are the attributes we capture the photograph. We have limited demographics. We capture the fingerprints and the iris. And mobile and email ID has been added because that helps to even authenticate using a one-time password and OTP, which goes to the this. And these are the attributes which we capture, and that is why I said it's reusable and you can't lose it, because these things, the fingerprints and your face and your iris remains with you. Next. This is the progress of how we progressed in terms of the enrollments. There was a peak in 2013-14, and now the focus is much more on the updates, and the updates are primarily of the address. So it becomes a kind of a proof of address also, so that people, any resident, when they change, and it seems to have stabilized at somewhere around 95 million per year that we update. So that shows also the mobility of people. Next. This is the saturation. The main thing is that adults more than 18 years, 99.5% have it. 0 to 5 always it's a moving goalpost, because every year new births are there, and that we keep on working on ensuring. Our objective is to ensure that every adult should have an Aadhaar. Next. Just coming to the authentication next. So what it means is whether are you who you claim to be, and by giving the authenticating the fingerprint, we can say a yes or no. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, anytime, anywhere. We have these small machines which are very cheap, which are available across villages also. So if someone wants to withdraw cash at the village level, they can do it from their bank accounts using this authentication. And wherever there needs to be a slightly greater details, the name, address, etc., they need that can also go to a business. So they can use that to give a SIM card. They can use that to authenticate a person and get some basic details of that person. Next. So this is how authentication is done. You give your Aadhaar number, or you can even give a virtual ID, so that this virtual ID you can keep changing also, so that if you have some fear of disclosing your Aadhaar, and you can use it, it can be authentication can be done by using the demographics or the biometrics, iris, fingerprint, or even by the mobile. An OTP can go depending on what level of authentication you want. That can be done. Next. So we have last year we had around 14 billion authentications. That just shows the usage, and the number of people requiring greater details, as you can see, is much more lower, and around 40 million. It's reached around 50 million now, and it's really increasing as we speak. Next. We are keeping the pricing extremely low. As I mentioned, we look upon it as a public good. So for any government services, it's exempt. There are no prices. And for private companies, we charge a very nominal fee per transaction. Next. Data security and privacy are utmost importance. And we always try to ensure that these are things that we keep on top of our agenda. And obviously for information security, it's an ongoing process which needs to be improved on a daily basis. And we do consent is very necessary before the use of the Aadhaar number or for any benefit transaction. So consent is extremely important for any use of the Aadhaar system. Next. Just I mentioned initially on the bank accounts, we call that the Jan Dhan bank accounts, the universal money bank accounts, which really took off once we combined the Aadhaar with the mobile and the bank account. So the Trinity, as we call it, has ensured that we are able to transfer funds to a lot of people, and on their mobiles, they get to know what funds have been transferred. And in fact, during COVID, this has been of extreme, very use that the government could transfer, cash transfers could be made to people just by using their mobile and transferring it through the Aadhaar as the financial address. Next. So on the impact, just a couple of words on that. Next. So all the ration cards, that's where the food subsidy is given, they have their Aadhaar numbers linked, so that person, whether who is getting the food subsidy is actually that person, is authenticated by the thumbprint. For cooking gas and LPG subsidy, so that to conserve environment and people don't use wood, we give cooking gas subsidy. That's been done. For livelihoods, for rural employment, again, Aadhaar is used for authenticate, and it goes directly into the bank accounts, and they're able to withdraw the funds even at the village level. And on the bank accounts, I already mentioned that it's really exploding the use of Aadhaar as a financial address. Next. This also helps in savings and welfare transfers, to remove ghost beneficiaries, to remove duplicate funds being going to the same person, to be able to target our subsidies to the correct population that we want to go. And this is just an estimate of some of the savings that have happened to government. Next. So this is some of the comments that various economists and other leaders have made. So I just thought I'll just leave it at this. And going forward, we look at further improving Aadhaar, how to ensure that ultimately it's the smartphone becomes the medium for all transactions, including on Aadhaar. So we are working on that, and let's see how that goes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garg. I understand you have to leave early, but let me capture you before you leave. Could you go back to the presentation you made with the lovely photos? The one maybe the one with how the Aadhaar can actually help, because you touch upon many important questions. One before this one, yes, this one. So it is financial inclusion, it is gender empowerment. You can see all these lovely photos, pictures, and also it is social inclusion. So we like to understand a bit more from you how you can actually link these only the biometric ID with so many other IDs everybody is facing, right? Because you also mentioned the food, energy, livelihood, services. Yes. So we like to know how you introduce this, and also how you actually have gone the journey since 2009, because this must be introduced because many other cards. How are you going to linking with them? And how do you really penetrate, especially in the rural areas? You mentioned the e-wallet, the e-KYC, all these very, very lovely samples. So just give us a few samples of any of these three critical issues. Thank you.
Maybe on the food, so we have this ration cards which are used to identify the family, and the Aadhaar numbers of the family are seeded in the ration card. So let us say a family has 5 people. So all the 5 Aadhaar cards are seeded in that database. And obviously the consent of the person is taken to seed the ration card with the Aadhaar number. So once it is seeded, we have these small biometric devices. They just cost a few dollars, which can record the fingerprint. So once any family member goes to the closest food shop where ration is distributed, on a monthly basis, they just authenticate using their fingerprint, and it confirms that this is the person of this family and this is their entitlement. And from the shop, they can get their food directly. And this also ensures, number one, that the same person cannot be in 2 ration cards. There cannot be any ghost beneficiary. So that's how we do it with food. Similarly, looking at cooking gas, on cooking gas, what has been done is the family which is eligible to get the cooking gas subsidy, they give their bank account details, and the Aadhaar number is linked to that bank account. So once they have given those details, the government can, using the Aadhaar as the financial address, the Aadhaar number is linked to the bank account. So through the banking system, the government can release every month whatever X number of rupees of LPG subsidy. It goes directly into the bank account of the person. The person gets a SMS message on their mobile that so and so funds have been deposited in your account, and that person can go to a local shop where we have what we call micro ATMs, which again, so the shopkeeper can confirm whether this is the person who is coming to withdraw, let's say 500 rupees. He is authenticated on that micro ATM. that micro ATM links that Aadhaar to the bank account. From the bank account, debits 500 rupees, and 500 rupees the local shopkeeper hands over. So it doesn't have to go to the bank to withdraw it. It can be done in any shop, and that 500 rupees gets transferred to that shopkeeper's account. So that's how it works. Similarly, livelihoods, we have what we call the work job cards, which are given. The job cards are again seeded with the Aadhaar numbers. So depending on how many days that person has worked, that information is fed on a weekly basis or fortnightly basis in the local office. And once they feed in that information, that how many days that person has worked, that information automatically on a daily wage basis transfers that much amount to that bank account using the Aadhaar number. And again, that process follows. The person gets to know what has been deposited on his mobile, and then they can withdraw. And I think what has also ensured is that a lot of women who normally would not be going to banks, who would be slightly hesitant to go to formal shops, are able to do that because they get the information on their mobile phones, and they can just go to the nearest shop and withdraw funds or take the food whatever is needed.
Wonderful, Dr. Garg. I particularly like the last sentence you just mentioned. Actually, I had felt that way when I visit a village. I had to go to that one of the room. It has only one, it's not really a bed, one place I can sit. I remember I sat with the female head household, you know, and then asking him what are the real challenges she has been facing, and what are the journeys she got after she got this biometric card. Because she couldn't speak English, I couldn't speak local language, so we used a translator, and she was just sharing with me how much empowerment this whole ID system has brought, especially to the rural areas, to the tribe areas, because they hardly go out of the tribe areas, and then they can link. This is the only link they can link to the outside world. It is really, really, really a huge difference it made on their life, and also transforming the whole family and linking connectivity. It's a real connectivity. I want to ask Mr. Shamit, are you there? Maybe you could ask some questions here. I think this would not be enough. I think we need to interact with you more on the real lovely stories. There must be a lot.
Would be happy to do that at a subsequent time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shah Hyong. Good afternoon, Dr. Garg. This is Shamit Chakravarti, as you can make out from my name. I'm from India. And, you know, as a student of economics, you know, I remember, you know, all the problems we've always faced. You know, we had very wonderful programs, welfare programs, but there was so much of leakage. You know, that was a huge problem. And I think Aadhaar and this Aadhaar linked benefit transfers has really kind of cracked that. And for once, we can be sure that, you know, most of the money is going to the designated beneficiaries. Till recently, I was working on the Philippines, Dr. Garg, you know, as supporting this big conditional cash transfer program. And I can see Jonathan Marskell of the World Bank also here. And we also always used to use the example of Aadhaar linked benefit transfers to kind of convince the Philippines government. And actually, they are moving in that direction. You know, the PhilSys, you know, they are now rolling that out, and we really hope that in the times to come, you know, most of the poor Filipinos will be able to use that to open their bank account, and, you know, the similar transformation we will see. So 2 quick questions, Dr. Garg. In India, you know, this National Payment Corporation, that's also a massive entity, right? We often hear about UIA, DAI, but that is there in the background. So the miracles promised by Aadhaar can only be done if you have that kind of IT infrastructure. So what happens in countries which may not have that kind of infrastructure? I mean, how does one help, or how can we learn from India? That's question number 1. Question number 2, it's you know, I have recently taken over as country director of Bhutan, ADB's country director of Bhutan. So maybe later I will get in touch with you, you know, how India is helping Bhutan. You know, that is something I would like to pursue. So quickly, two questions. This National Payment Corporation of India, massive, right? Yeah. Thank you so much.
So thank you. And Mr. Chaudhary would be happy to work with you at any time on what you want to do in Bhutan. But to your first question, you're absolutely right. UIDI, we look upon it as the digital backbone. And on this backbone, a number of applications can be built. So one of the applications that has been built is making Aadhaar as the financial address, obviating the need of a bank account to be mentioned. In fact, I noticed a question which someone had mentioned that are people willing to give bank accounts? And you're very right, people in general are not willing to give a bank account to an unknown person, but they don't mind giving an Aadhaar number because they know that to go from the Aadhaar number to the bank account, you need to have a biometric authentication. You need the fingerprint or the iris, which only that person has in person. It's not even stored anywhere and someone can steal it. So, and apart from that, if the person even doesn't want to share the Aadhaar, we give a temporary virtual ID on the mobile. They can just ask for an ID and that can be used for the transaction. And after that transaction, the virtual ID disappears. It has no meaning, it cannot be used. So you're absolutely right, but you need that basic infrastructure of having the biometrics of 1.3 billion people to be able to build on other applications, whether it's investment or pension or banking, savings, or a host of anything else. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I think that addressed the question pretty well. I actually like the question Erica asked in this open forum. We often face this issue in developing countries on how to actually increase financial inclusion, especially for the women population. So that is exactly the problem. When I remember, I tried to drill down to the bottom of the issue. Many female bank account holders, even they don't like to come out for survey because there's many hurdles in the real world. So probably we need to discuss that separately in a separate forum because that is financial inclusion forum. So for today's purpose, I want to ask, is there any other questions we'd like to ask before we ask Mr. Garg? Because we need to invite you more. And
sure, I'll be happy to come.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to come, but thank you for inviting me and thank you for your understanding in allowing me to go early.
Yeah, I have another question for you. Who is this? Akapo, you have another question for Mr. Garg?
Yes, thank you so much, Seo Hong, and good afternoon, Dr. Gash. I have a quick question. I'm currently from Southeast Asia Department, and I'm developing the e-government project in Timor-Leste, where the IT infrastructure and technical capacity of the government is quite limited. And we always look up for the country example, country experience like Aadhaar in India, Fusis in Philippines, national ID in Thailand to communicate with our government counterpart. We want to learn from you, Dr. Gash. You have more than a decade of experiencing development of UID. And during the initial stage of development, how do you sequence in terms of the stages to transform the country into unique ID systems? And how do you link it with the service delivery? Because the UID system is a means, it's not the end goal. The end goal is actually the improved service delivery. I want to hear from you how you overcome technical capacity constraint and the limited IT infrastructure. Is there any way that the government should focus on at the beginning? And what is the next phase? How you build up the UID system that lead to improve service delivery? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question that you ask, and I think couple of things. One is on the, as you mentioned, the limited ID infrastructure. We work only with open source so that we don't get locked to any particular vendor. And that's been right from the beginning that we are doing that. We use open source software. Second, people have to value the need to have this ID. So that was very important to be able to pass on the message that use of this ID would also help them to get different services and get empowered or enabled for different services. So that linkage needs to be there very early. And the very fact that an ID in itself has value, because it allows people to say who they are at any time, anywhere. So having that card or having some kind of a physical ID also help. So it's a number of activities that have to run. One has to work as in the whole of the government approach more holistically. And what is equally important is to involve the private sector and have a number of partners right from the beginning so that they can also help in developing different activities which build on this ID. So it takes time. It's taken us 10 years to reach where we are. But I think if there is a commonality of approach and of the need to go to that particular goal, a lot of the pieces come together. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'll really have to rush now. Is that all right, Ms. Hong, if I can leave?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation.
I look forward to being in touch as we move along.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So now our second speaker is Ms. Tipsuna, and she is actually the former financial market regulator. So she is a security regulator with a special interest in this market development, competition, policy, and some et cetera. So she actually is now serving a board of Thailand Electronic Transactions Development Agency, and she has 26 experience in this field, and she received the MBA from Wharton and UPenn, and also her AB is in math from Harvard University. Over to you, Tipsoda. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to share with you today is my thoughts on Thailand's journey in developing the national digital ID system, but it will not be from a technical angle, as you know that I'm a former securities regulator. So my experience with digital ID topic came when I was a securities regulator trying to facilitate eKYC and faster onboarding and so on. So it's from that perspective, as well as that of a citizen who witnessed the struggle to drive adoption. And as you see, the challenge that Thailand faces is not in the technical design and governance, but it's in the policy and implementation. Next slide. Okay. Thailand has had a long history of national ID system. So we've had, the current national ID system has been in use since 1984. That's like almost 40 years ago. Each Thai citizen is assigned a unique 13-digit number as ID since birth by this Department of Provincial Administration, or DOPA. And in 2005, a smart card-based ID system was launched. And in that system, the card has important personal information encoded and encrypted in the smart card chip. And there's a laser code on the back. I think the design is so that you can really use the smart card reader to do the verification. But it turned out that it wasn't used that much in the way that it was expected to. The government agencies were provided with smart card readers to conduct transactions in an offline manner, and few were using the smart card readers for verification. The government services still required paper copies of ID cards for transactions. And sometimes they even copy like the front and the back, so all the laser code get copied also. Then in 2014, government data exchange became operational, so that enabled online use of smart card readers. Next. Okay. Now, the idea of digital ID came much later in our timeline. It was included in the 2017 master plan for implementing the Doing Business portal, that one-stop service portal that facilitates businesses in setting up companies and obtaining all the necessary licenses in one go. And then in 2019, the Electronic Transactions Act was amended and include the clauses on digital ID governance and standards. And the Electronic Transactions Development Agency, or ETSDA, was tasked with being the regulator and standard setting body. And then in the same year, another law on digital government stipulated all government agencies to have a system for digital identification and verification for the purpose of facilitating services to the people. But even, with all that laws, implementation has not been that easy. Next slide. Okay, from my observation, the real drive for digital ID came from the financial service industry and the financial regulators. The securities brokerage licenses were fully liberalized in 2012. So by 2017, the SEC Thailand was looking to facilitate competition further by lowering the cost of switching providers. So in doing so, we would like to help speed up the customer onboarding process. And the idea of eKYC and customer data portability was explored, and digital ID naturally was a key component. Next slide. Then on the banking side, in 2015, the National E-Payment Master Plan led to the need to verify and authenticate identities online. And so in 2018, the company called National Digital ID, or NDID, was set up to provide connectivity for all parties to perform their roles securely and efficiently as relying parties and identity providers and authoritative sources. But I have to point out that the company name, NDID, is a little bit misleading because there's nothing national about it. It was the financial service industry stepping in to create an infrastructure to enable digital identification instead of just waiting for the government's mandate. NDID is owned by financial and capital market institutions and receives support and blessing from the Ministry of Finance and the financial regulators. The platform, I think, it has a very good design. It uses a federated approach where the relying party can rely on multiple identity providers for verification, and they can rely on multiple sources of information providers. And no sensitive personal data pass through the system or are retained anywhere in the platform. There's no single point of failure. The platform was designed to support any technology and future innovation. But with all that great stuff, the usage is very limited. In 2020, the Bank of Thailand allowed banks to open accounts for individuals online under their sandbox scheme, but we have yet to see use beyond that. I must say though, well, next slide, that although Thailand has the necessary tools and standards, we are not moving fast enough with digital ID adoption. Bank account opening online, it's very easy for individuals, and it's very quick. But corporate accounts still require a lot of paperwork and lengthy process. And we can pay tax online, So the Revenue Department did a good job, but most other government-related transactions must be done in person. So what is holding us back? Next slide. In my opinion, these are the key challenges that Thailand needs to overcome. First, there should be an authority with a clear vision of what we want to achieve with our digital ID system, like in the case of India. So that authority could be the champion for the initiatives, and that authority could be the one to ensure that there is adoption in all government services that really matter. But what we have right now is a rather fragmented arrangement where EDDA is the standard setter for digital ID service providers. And then another agency called the Digital Government Development Agency, or DGA, sets the standards for digital identification process adopted by the government agencies, and that agency provides supporting service to the government. But without an authoritative champion, even if we have these standard setters, the adoption itself depends on individual readiness of each government agency. So where there is need and the government does not move quickly enough, then sometimes the private sector would step in. And that was the case with the National Digital ID, where the financial service sector went ahead and set up a platform with the blessing of the Ministry of Finance, because at the time, DOPA, the issuer of national ID, had not yet come on board. Although the platform was designed to support a wide range of transactions, so far its use has been limited only to bank account opening. High fee has often been cited as a reason for the platform's inability to serve startup fintech companies. And that wouldn't be surprising, because if the private sector set up this platform, then they put in the money, they would have to be also trying to make profit. The COVID situation has brought about a sense of urgency and increase in the adoption, but performance has been constrained by bureaucratic silos, especially where data or authority belong to multiple agencies. So this results in a frustrating situation where citizens sometimes they must re-enter personal information repeatedly, even for the same service provided in different channels. A case in point would be the COVID vaccine booking. And even where the adoption initiatives might come from the private sector, they may also run into legal obstacles or legal uncertainty, some not having anything at all to do with digital ID. And some problems can be fixed by the relevant regulators, but others can only be solved by a law amendment, which takes time and commitment. Next slide. So EDDA, which does not have the full authority to drive this, but is just the standard setter. This is what EDDA is trying to do, in whatever capacity it can, to facilitate and to improve digital ID adoption. First, because they're the standard setter, they have to take care of that. So the relevant rules and standards have been drafted, and the content have been published as recommendations while waiting for the actual royal decree to be passed. So some needs to be passed in a formal form. And in doing so, EDDA works closely with the Digital Government Agency, who sets the standards for government agencies so that they can ensure interoperability. At the next level, where there are legal obstacles, then EDDA helps coordinate with various regulators and ministries to find solutions that rely on our standards and guidelines. And these examples come in the next layer, which is the sandbox. EDDA created a sandbox last year to provide an experimental space for those who want to try new solutions using digital technology. So this is not just with digital ID and everything, but digital ID is a big part of it. So participants in the sandbox would receive guidance from EDDA as well as other relevant regulators. And in this sandbox, even the Department of Provincial Administration, or DOPA, the issuer of the National Digital ID, finally participated. They came on board and participate in the program with a pilot project in digital identification and authentication for selected government services. So we're hoping that this EDDA sandbox will encourage new use cases and will create a virtuous cycle of innovation, inspiring more government agencies to come on board. And then this will help speed up digital ID adoption. But in the end, I believe that we still need an authority to drive this forward, and this should be escalated to our national agenda. Next slide. Okay, here are some of our examples of the digital ID applications in the EDDA sandbox in the past. Well, first, the online shareholders meetings. This became necessary last year because of COVID. Some public companies even went ahead with hybrid meetings despite legal uncertainty. When the government amended the law last year to allow cross-border participation, and before then they allowed online meetings that all participants have to be in Thailand. And I think back then they also stipulated that at least 1/3 have to be in the same place. So they removed all that obstacle, which you will see that this has nothing to do with digital ID. Then once they cleared the obstacle on the meeting side, EDDA worked on the standards for online voting. And online voting using digital ID was being tested in the sandbox by one of the participants. So EDDA concurrently work with them while writing up the recommended standard for e-voting system. And this was subsequently published. And the same online voting sandbox applicant also tested the technology with condominium unit holders meeting, which also received good cooperation from the land department, which is the regulator for condo. Coming soon to the sandbox will be the bank account opening online for companies. Although it is easy to open individual bank accounts, opening a company account requires a lot more paperwork. Developing a digital ID system for companies is more complex task than individuals' ID. Initially, the Bank of Thailand and EDDA have agreed to set up a joint sandbox in which companies can have their authorized persons open a corporate bank account fully online. And in the future, we hope to bring on board the Ministry of Public Health for digital health records and vaccine passports. Next slide. There are also other considerations for digital ID adoption. It is important to include those who are not digital ready. So for example, what can we do for people who do not have smart devices? One idea might be to set up smart kiosks in convenient locations so they can use their old ID cards. Novel authentication technologies such as face verification and modern biometric technology should be explored. And they might help simplify things and reduce barrier of access and improve user experience. The difficulty I see though is that when you use biometrics, because you only have one set of biometrics, if it's compromised, then that would be kind of risky. Next slide. Okay, this is my last slide. This is what EDDA proposes to be Thailand's digital ID framework. It's still an aspiration. Citizens should be able to transact or receive a host of services online using digital identification verification with ease, while having full control of how their identities and personal information are shared and used, with full transparency in the process. DOPA will issue foundational digital ID for all Thais, but eventually I think our system should cover juristic persons as well as foreign individuals. DOPA and another department called the Department of Business Development, or DBD, they are the registrar for companies. They should be the main authoritative sources. The range of services available to citizens should cover all government services that matter. There should be a single access to government services. And this single access should also be connected to other digital ID platforms such as the NDID and the mobile national ID. And EDA will have to work together with DGA and other relevant regulators to create standards for all parties to ensure interoperability domestically and internationally. I'm hopeful that this framework will soon be implemented. It's taken us long enough. The framework has been agreed upon by all relevant regulators and government agencies, and the private sector is more than ready. Banks, telecom operators, and other willing players, and the standards and regulators are already there to ensure trust and transparency, privacy, and security. So all it needs is a clear directive from a dedicated authority to drive adoption and commitment from relevant regulators to pave the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. And this is very interesting. You talked about all the barriers and then the challenges, especially how the sandbox regulators can actually drive some of the pilot to remove the barriers. That's very interesting. So before I open the floor, maybe I just hand it over to Jonan-san. Are you there? Jonan-san is our Senior Program Officer of World Bank, who has been leading this identification for development for a long time. Before the World Bank, he also worked for UN, many UN agencies, including SCAP, UNICEF, UNHCR, and IOM. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me and you can see the presentation.
We do, we can hear you. Go
Excellent.
ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to ADB for the invitation to speak. It's also really good to see some familiar faces or names rather. We've had great collaboration in the Philippines, in the Pacific, and also soon in Timor-Leste. I'm going to provide some more information about the World Bank's perspective on this topic and agenda, as well as the principles on identification for sustainable development that were mentioned. But I also do want to acknowledge that participants have been blessed to have both India and Thailand present, especially before me. India is an example of doing this at an extraordinary speed and scale and level of impact, as what Dr. Garg presented, and is certainly has many good practices for other countries to follow, and has become really a source of many public goods for this agenda, including open source software such as MOSIP, but also a lot of consultants and knowledge sharing opportunities, as what SY wrote in the chat. Likewise, I'm going to mention Thailand a few times in my presentation. I had the good fortune to be living in Bangkok for nearly 6 years. And I also saw the paradox that the citizen ID that Kun Titsuda mentioned, pretty much everyone has it. And Thailand has made a lot of progress in terms of closing coverage gaps, for example, amongst minorities and hill tribes. And it really underpins a lot of the society, but the challenge is moving from the physical card, and I've got one that you kind of can see it as a souvenir from my time working with the Ministry of Interior in Thailand. But the paradox that has not been fully used for online transactions, and I'm going to cover that a little bit, not in the context of Thailand, but generally. So about ID4D, my program, we're actually kind of like a central secretariat or hub with a multi-donor trust fund within the bank. And you can see on the left here, there's 12 parts of the bank group who are actually part of ID4D. And the directors at the global level, they meet on a monthly basis. And we report to them. And we have technical level working groups. So actually, ID4D does not necessarily lead projects. It's our global practice or sectoral teams. So for example, in the Philippines, it's digital development. In other countries, it may be social protection. In others, it may be financial sector. And you'll see those sectors there on the left, that matches what Kun Titsuda mentioned, presented in our last slide, all these benefits and use cases. We have three pillars of work: thought leadership, which is essentially research. And some of you may have heard of the statistic that there's 1 billion people around the world without a legal identity. That's from our data set. We publish other research and tools that you can find on our website. We do global platforms and convening. This includes a lot of advocacy, but contributing to standards and global public goods such as open source software, peer-to-peer knowledge exchanges. We're fortunate to have shared a lot of experience with India with countries like the Philippines, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Pacific Island countries, and the same for Thailand as well. And then at the country level, we're active in 49 countries currently. Around 35 of them are with financing, either pipeline or active, worth about $1.8 billion. Last year, we also launched a sister initiative, which is called G2PX, which is digitizing government-to-person payments. And you may recognize this from the Indian experience, where there was such a strong link between getting everyone a digital identity and then empowering them with digital financial services. And so what our sister initiative, G2PX, is about using cash transfers, government-to-person payments, to empower vulnerable populations, especially women and girls. And the combination of ID and payments and data is what I'll talk about in a moment. I mentioned the 1 billion people. I think also it's worth noting on the top right there, I've seen one estimate that there's 3.5 billion people in addition to the one. So in other words, half the world's population who may have an ID, but it's not particularly useful in the digital age. In other words, it's paper-based and non-verifiable. There's some countries in the region where, for example, Myanmar, where there's, lots of people have IDs, but it's just a piece of paper. And so it's not particularly useful in this day and age with the digital economy, digital society, and digital government. And they face barriers not just in terms of accessing services, but also economic opportunities that are being created with the rapid digital transformation, and coming with that the risk of exacerbating digital divides. And of course, you probably have heard that there's an SDG target on legal identity for all. In terms of service delivery, again, this will look very familiar from the last presentation, the previous presentations. ID is really a platform. We see digital ID as a platform for not just these sectors on the screen, but many others. For the financial sector, Dr. Garg mentioned financial inclusion. When you consider that in 2011, 35% of adults in India had a bank account, and 6 years later, it increased to 80%, it wasn't Aadhaar alone. It was it's the so-called JAM trinity of the Jandan bank accounts, the Aadhaar and mobile devices with the direct benefits transfers, that literally hundreds of millions of people got bank accounts in this period. And the biggest increases were indeed experienced by women and poorer populations. In Thailand, in the early 2000s, when Thailand wanted to introduce universal health insurance, they had 5 existing public health insurance schemes. There was duplication across them, and there was people who fell between the cracks. In fact, the coverage around them was, from memory, around 70–75%. They simply used the national identity card system as the basis for reforming all of that. So they identified who was in existing programs, they put them in one program and removed them from the other programs. And then they knew who had an ID but wasn't in a health insurance program. And then they enrolled them automatically into the 30 baht scheme. And within a matter of years, sorting through this data, they reached 98% health insurance coverage, and Thailand now is a global model for UHC. For social protection, there's many good examples, but in Pakistan, when it comes to emergency relief, when there's floods, for example, in 2010, the government used the national ID card to verify eligibility for some of the humanitarian emergency relief, and we estimate that they saved around $250 million. And then there's the famous case of Estonia, where 99% of government transactions can be done completely online. The only things you can't do online are get married, get divorced, and transfer real property. So that's certainly a success story. And where I am in Singapore now, it's also something very similar. Now, we also conceptualize identity as part of a broader stack. Of course, it depends on some foundations of the data infrastructure, connectivity, capacity, and skills, and electricity. But once you have digital identity and electronic signatures, this unlocks opportunities for data sharing and empowerment. And in fact, if digital identity is who are you, or are you who you say you are, that only solves part of the problem of online transactions. Actually, what is more important is what you are. It's not that I'm Jonathan Maskell, it's that I've got this degree, I own this property, and I've got this bank account, I've got this track record, I've got this vaccine certificate, etc. Of course, you need to link that to Jonathan Maskell, but the real value comes in the what you are. So sharing data from authoritative sources, and Kun Tipsuda mentioned that concept in the Thailand presentation. So linking identity to different authoritative sources and providing people the ability or empowering them to share that data with consent. Then, of course, there's use cases such as digital payments and financial services. Now, tackling this agenda as well, you can't treat Timor-Leste in Thailand, for instance, the same way. And this is kind of a maturity model, let's say, on looking at different country contexts. Of course, every country will need institutional and legal enablers and safeguards. And this includes for data protection and cybersecurity, but also includes inclusion. Kun Tipsuda mentioned the digital divide and the use, for example, of kiosks. That's a very practical example of making this available to people in rural areas, people who do not have devices. I mean, think of the elderly. My 90-year-old grandmother cannot use a digital device. So how do you ensure that they're not left behind? There's always work that needs to be done. Then the bottom layer of the pyramid is the foundational systems. This is the national identity systems. This is the civil registries. This is about getting people officially recognized and giving them the basic ability to prove that. And you know, there's few countries in the Asia Pacific region that are at this, that lack this completely. There's several that need help to increase coverage or strengthen them. But generally, the region performs well compared to, for example, Africa and some the Middle East. Then the next two layers, one is about improving identity services. So if we take the Thailand example, when Thailand introduced the smart cards and started distributing readers to government agencies and providing access to the national ID database to allow government agencies to verify data. So this is the beginning of the linkage with service delivery, particularly for identity verification. Then the top of the pyramid is digital identity for online remote transactions. Now this is separated because the layer before it, you can do face-to-face, but online, being able to do the same transactions that you can do online as you do face-to-face, that requires a lot of security and assurance. Now, countries like Singapore and Estonia and other European countries have accomplished this, and some Asian countries like Korea, for example. But this is a real challenge. And likewise, making these identities interoperable, not just I mean, Kun Tipsuda mentioned, the distinction between the private and the public sector. That's very common. But even within those, I mean, there's a focus on the financial sector, but there's many other sectors where this will be beneficial. But what about across countries? So within the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025, there is actions to use cross-border digital identity. And there's an opportunity for a coalition of the willing ASEAN member states to really do this. And the Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, possibly the Philippines and Indonesia, it creates exciting opportunities for the regional digital economy. Now, there's also emerging approaches that are different to a centralized one where the verification is against a single database. Kun Tipsuda presented the Ndid Framework, which is a federation where you create a marketplace, let's say, of identity providers who will issue the identity based on an authoritative source, but they provide the verification services, and relying parties can, have a menu of identity providers, and citizens have a menu of identity providers to choose from. This provides choice, it promotes innovation, but it requires a very strong trust framework. It requires standards, rules, enforcement, etc. And it's been successful to some extent in France. It's emerging in Australia, in Canada. The UK Verify scheme was a federation. It didn't work. The most famous federation, though, for this kind of thing is EIDAS, the European Union's framework for cross-border digital identity. Now, coming to decentralized identity on your screen, this is the next paradigm shift, which is that you issue people a credential, like a physical ID card, and they store it in their wallet as a smartphone app, right? And the EIDAS, European Union, is amending their regulation to create the possibility for European digital wallets, where I can download my national ID card from France, my vaccine certificate from Germany, my university degree from Belgium, and store it in my phone. Just like Apple Wallet is now emerging, you may have seen, for US driving licenses. Some countries now are integrating their vaccine certificates into there, etc. This opens enormous opportunities for the digital economy, but importantly, the verification is against the credential rather than the database. So this provides further empowerment to the citizen, that the source of the data, the credential issuer, don't know what transactions are taking place. So from a privacy perspective, this is great. Also, it incentivizes an ecosystem that would be interoperable by default, right? So it's not system to database doing the transaction. It's system to any credential that meets this standard. And so therefore, multiple systems emerge that meet those standards. And there is already a standard for this, which is the verifiable credential standard by the World Wide Web Consortium. So anyway, to cut a long story short, as was mentioned in the introduction, in 2017, a group of organizations, which include the World Bank and ADB, I think there was around 10 to 15 at that time, came up with principles that would maximize the benefits of digital identity systems while mitigating the risks. The principles were released in 2017. As I mentioned, ADB was one of the founders, along with several UN agencies, the Gates Foundation, etc. The organizations agreed in a few years from then to revisit the principles. At the beginning of this year, we published a new set. The list of endorsing organizations has increased to 30. You will see some familiar logos there. On the far right, you'll see the Digital Nations, which is a forum of the leading digital countries. It includes Canada, Korea, Israel, New Zealand. Are part of that. So it really creates a consensus on what good ID looks like. Now, I'm not going to go through the 10 principles one by one, but just to say that they cut across 3 themes of inclusion, design, and governance. And in fact, I would say that a lot of the issues that Kun Tipsuda mentioned would probably resonate in one or more of these principles around clear mandates and accountability, number 9, about removing barriers to access and use, so the inclusion aspect in number 2, protecting privacy, open standards, etc. So this kind of, these 10 principles have been very useful for us and other organizations as an advocacy tool to focus discussions, to have a lightning rod to start to talk about what are good and bad practices in the design and implementation of ID systems. At the World Bank, we've incorporated this into a lot of our knowledge materials. We have an ID4D practitioner's guide, which is a several hundred-page how to design an ID system. Fortunately, it's not just a PDF, it's also a website, so you're welcome to access that. But all of our other materials also cross-reference and leverage the principles as a guiding framework. There's been several global initiatives that have used it. So the UN's high-level panel on digital cooperation recognized it. The G7 Women's Digital Financial Inclusion Initiative in Africa, UNHCR for their statelessness initiative, the FATF in their digital identity guidance published last year, which we co-authored with the US Treasury, also recommends implementation of these principles. But most importantly, at the country level, in the ADB region, 3 countries stand out. The Philippines have used the principles as part of their implementation strategy, as part of their procurement approach, as part of their technical design, etc. In Samoa as well, it's a key part of their national digital ID strategy. And Timor-Leste, in their unique ID strategic plan, they've not just adopted the principles, but they've adapted them for their local context, which is wonderful to see. So to close, 3 messages. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that ID is crucial for development, but also it's important that we get this right. So in other words, good ID. It's very easy to get excited about biometrics, about smart cards, about mass registration, but this can really lead to exclusion and other security risks. So it's important to get this right. And therefore, the principles offer a framework, an advocacy tool, a normative tool to do that. And finally, although there's 10 principles, it fits on one slide, there is a larger document that I encourage you to read to familiarize yourself with what each of these mean. I will stop there, Jiao Hong. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The key messages are loud and clear. I like these 10 principles and all the journeys World Bank has gone through. The floor is now open. Let me try to ask a mission leader like Akapo, since you're working in Timor-Leste, so there might be a lot of questions you have. Probably I can, if I may, to ask you to come in to ask the first question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seo Hong, for giving me this opportunity. Definitely, thank you so much, Jonathan, for mentioning the UID development plan in Timor-Leste. And we hope to continue to collaborate with the World Bank team on this. From ADB side, we have been working with the authorities, especially the TIC, to develop the infrastructure platform, which is going to be the basis for the national ID systems. I think the key issue here is something that we would like to address at the beginning, similar to what Khun Tipsuda mentioned, which is the fragmentation in the governance of the e-government and the national ID systems. We want this process, the adoption of the UID, to be the whole of the government approach rather than the fragmented approach as we see in many countries, because if the government don't go with the adoption in a comprehensive way, they will cause a lot of layers, and there may be the coordination issue. And from the World Bank perspective, and I would like to hear also from Khun Tipsuda, how do you plan to address this issue? We know that these are the common experience that we have seen in so many countries, and for the country like Timor-Leste, which start to embark on this journey, how they can do things properly to make sure that the whole of the government approach is being adopted. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me also jump in to ask a World Bank question. I saw one of the slides, you show there's a lot of logos and you get a lot of supporters now, including, we know, like the Center for Global Development. They have done quite a lot of good seminars. So probably we can work with like a Bill Gates Foundation, try to really collect some good lessons and the good experience of the South-South cooperation, because when it comes to this digital identification development, the developing country experience is quite different from the developed countries. So what's your plan to expand the partnership platform? Because countries, this global identification gap is huge in each country. every single country. We know that. So what's your plan to take this forward in terms of partnership platform to really share experience with global, regional, national levels at different levels? That would be very interesting. Any practical work we can work together, it would be, because we have a good team behind here. Maybe I ask SY, do you have anything you want to ask? We also have one open question for you. Maybe you can read there, Jonathan, over back to you. Thank you.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, why not? Thank you.
Sure. Okay. First, Kun Ekpon, thank you so much for your question. I mean, these are very common issues across all ID projects, that having a whole of government approach. But of course, I think this is common across any digital government type activity. I think what's important is there's a very famous way of explaining it that Korea has, which is in the early days after the separation, it was a system of control to know who was a citizen, for conscription, those kind of things. Gradually, as the country became more developed, it was used as a digitizing government to make it more efficient. And then in the 2000s, obviously, through rapid development, lots of domestic capacity built as well, they shifted to more sophisticated approaches, which is more empowerment. And I think that mindset of shifting from digital identity for a registration and tool of administration to a tool of empowerment, and I think this is very well explained in the Thai experience and the Indian experience, is very key. And then the leadership at the highest levels of government. Actually, Aadhaar was really championed by two Indian prime ministers. And so having that champion at the highest level of government is key to addressing issues around mandate and inertia. But even those ingredients are not enough. I think what's important is to make a business case to those service providers to adopt identity systems, to change their system, to change how they do business. That requires a lot of research. And finally, I would say it requires a lot of patience. The PhilSys was conceptualized in 2017. The law was passed in 2018. Mass registration started at the end of 2020. And really that was accelerated quite a bit. So it requires a bit of patience to get this right, especially in a country like Timor-Leste, where it's great that that ADB is investing in the data center and the infrastructure and whatnot. I mean, if those don't exist, it will take even longer to do this properly. So there has to be a patience for results. To come to the question about partnership platforms, we are very keen to partner with like-minded stakeholders like ADB. We've had good collaboration in a number of countries I mentioned earlier. I think tangibly in this region, I think more can be done to elevate this agenda. In Africa, there's a lot of development interest around the identity agenda. Of course, they've got a bigger identity coverage gap. Asia's got more of an identity quality and utilization gap. And so I think it needs a bit of a different framing, but I think if we can work together to elevate this agenda, I think will be very useful. So I think at the country level, there's obviously complementary TA, there's co-financing, which we do with a number of IFIs in Africa, potentially could be done in this region. I think also joint knowledge events would be very key, joint publications, those kind of things. And then finally, I see there's a question here, but perhaps I'll let Kun Titsuda respond to that question while I catch up on the written ones.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything, tips, Sudha, you want to add? Because that question in the open chat actually is good for you.
Oh, let me check the open chat. Which question? This is the typical challenge.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in my, I think I totally agreed with Jonathan. You need to have that at the highest level. You need to have that support from the highest level. The leader needs to have that vision, and then all the government agencies need to have that shared vision of what you want the digital ID to be able to do for you, because it shouldn't be an end in itself. It's a foundation for other things, empowerment, good government services. With that shared vision, then you can have more imagination and the willingness for the government agencies to explore things that they can improve their service with this digital ID, rather than sticking to fulfilling what they are ordered to do bureaucratically. And then, with that shared vision, again, the willingness to fix the bureaucratic obstacles. Now, all that said, I can give you an example. 3 years ago, I've seen the government, maybe even 4 years ago, when this whole idea of the digital ID started being included in our various government agenda. There was a cabinet resolution that said government agencies are not allowed to ask for copies of paper copies of IDs when citizens come to get their service, and by that, I think they interpret it as well, you can come to the government office and use the smart card readers there to read the card and give the service. So that still doesn't cover like remote services, that where the citizens do not come face to face. And worse yet, that order says something like, if you are still going to require paper copies, then you have to make sure that it's not done at the expense of the citizens. So it read almost as if they're allowed to still call for paper copies, but they just can't. They just have to provide a copy machine, and they can't charge for it. And I think that's the way it's been done. So you could see that with that kind of order and interpretation, we're not achieving anything close to a digital government service. And and that order was repeated only a few days ago. So I'm a little worried that if we don't start at the highest level, having that clear understanding of what digital ID could do, or what you want it to look like, then it's left to the lower level ministry. And so even though they tasked the digital government agency with the authority to make standards, that agency doesn't have the power to speed up or to require government agencies to do anything. They're just setting standards. So it's like there's no one pushing it. Yeah. So I'm hoping that the sandbox is just a small way to nudge it forward and make people talk about it, show that this is a good example, and then maybe motivate other people to join. And that's what EDDA has been trying to do on the side, but I don't know how to fix it at the higher level.
Maybe deregulation, too much regulation when it comes to country. All the line ministry have their own rules, and they, instead of using too much silos, and instead of thinking that's foundation, they can provide value addition services, but they are thinking of differently. I think that is a kind of mindset. Will take time, but I think World Bank also has ID for Africa initiative in this, and then there will be a lot of Asian experience, quite unique. So probably this kind of forum we're working on now, we should do more. There is also one open question, Jonathan, is to you,
yes.
and that is an interesting one. Could you take it over? Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to tackle both because Darlene's question also on paper and pen in the Philippines is one that's close to my heart because before I joined the bank in 2016, I was with the UN in Bangkok and did some work on civil registration in the Philippines and since around 2012. And if you ever want to feel passionate about this topic, you can go to any PSA or previously the NSO office and see people waiting in line to get their birth certificate because they have to submit a copy of their birth certificate, whether it's for a passport application or whatever kind of government transaction. And sometimes you'll see people waiting outside in the heat, obviously, and may have traveled a long way in order to do this. And so the shift of the Philippines to a digital society with electronic transactions, et cetera, I think is something that's very close to my heart. Now, in terms of how to do it, I think obviously there's going to be a need for cultural and changes within government agencies and frankly, the private sector. And likewise, I think there needs to be some very good high profile examples for other countries to follow, for other agencies to follow. So investing in particular services like passport applications online completely, those kind of things I think is key. And I'm very happy that with World Bank and ADB support, the PhilSys is adopting a lot of that. And actually the PSA, DICT and NEDA deserve a lot of credit because this project is accomplishing a lot against strong headwinds and hopefully will be a model for other similar projects in the Philippines. One last thing on that question is, it's interesting that the Philippines has had an electronic commerce law since 2006. So the concept of electronic commerce and electronic transactions is 15 years old. However, it's not been implemented. And so I think there needs to be incentives and enforcement for actual implementation. For the other question on what are the common challenges? So I think Kun Tipsuda's presentation highlighted some of the main fundamental challenges. I would say that the most significant challenges, yes, infrastructure and funding are gapped, but the biggest challenge is the political will and the coordination. Honestly, funding is not an issue. I think between the World Bank, ADB, other donors, and frankly, domestic resources, there is enough to implement these systems because there's such a strong business case, especially when it's linked to cash transfers, digitalization of societies, financial inclusion, etc. So the issue is the political will to address the coordination issues, the implementation issues. I think those are the most fundamental, along with the legal reforms. Unfortunately, in some countries, the laws in place, from colonial era or from the 1960s and 70s, that really holds back a lot of the innovations. One practical example is specifying technologies and processes in laws rather than in guidelines and regulations. That's very difficult to unravel. So being more forward-looking on legal frameworks is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Looks like World Bank, ADB, and plus other, together with countries, we can do some good case studies on those successful samples, and then moving forward, that could be interesting. Maybe we are 3 minutes away from closing of session. Any one want to come over? I think SY, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Thank you very much, panelists. Very good presentation. And then also, I'm very appreciate your very insightful sharing experience, particularly in Thailand. And also, Jonathan, your presentation is quite good and comprehensive, covering everything on ID for development. And then I have just one question to Tipsta in Thailand case. Recently, I read an article that your agency had an agreement with IBM on the developing standard for digital signature. So I just wondering, do you have any principle to work with private sector on digital ID, what kind of division of work between government and then private sector you have in mind? That is just one question I want to run from Thailand experience. Thank you.
I'm sorry to say that I can't answer that because I'm only on the board, and I don't know everything that they do in detail. But we work with the private sector a lot. And this particular one on digital signature, I don't know the detail, but for example, the rules or the standards that we set, we work closely with the private sector who are using the standards, especially those that come to our sandbox, to make sure that it's practical. But no, I can't give you any detail on a digital signature. Sorry.
Thank you, Tipsuda. I think SY asked an excellent question. When it comes to digital ID, it is always PPP, public-private partnership. So probably we can focus on some quick, good samples in our case studies would also help to roll it out how these two sectors could really come together. Thank you so much. Tipsuda, that is probably something you can help us find out further after the event. Thank you. Anybody else who likes to come in? Otherwise, I'd like to thank you once again, and a very big team behind, very small team actually behind, but have done a lot of work. And Thomas, you want to come over to have a quick, are you still there, Thomas? Yeah,
yes,
Thomas, very good, Thomas. Over to you. So Thomas is
I would
our
just like
chief.
to thanks for inviting me, Xiaohong, and thanks for moderating, and also thanks for the panelists, because this is a very important topic that we are investing more in, and we definitely want to follow up, and as you had mentioned, work more closely together. So with that, I think that's it. I don't want to take people too long.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, SY. Thank you all the team who made this event a successful, very interactive. Thank you so much. Have a pleasant day. Thank you. Welcome you join us, and hopefully you will become a digital fan from now on, ID fan. Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Tipsuda. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Stay safe,
Thank you,
everyone.
Shamat. Yeah, you're still here. Thank you, Shamat.
Yes,
Thank you.
I've been here throughout. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, despite your busy schedule.
Thank
you.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaohong, and the panelists. Aside from the wealth of information, I think it was really great to see, witness the lively partnership as well as the new ones forming. So before we lose everybody, it would be really great if you could all take a minute to take the poll and tell us what you thought of today's session. And please keep a lookout for an email from us with an instruction on how to access the recording of today's session as well as the past sessions. And there will be a short survey for you to let us know additional feedback so that we can improve our curation in the future. And tomorrow, we have our first live interactive sessions at Virtual Tech Expo that offer from companies that offer innovative digital solutions for development projects. So do check them out. And next week, we have a whole new set of talks and panel discussions on themes related to digital for work or workplace. So we look forward to having you back here. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you for that. Thank you.